Welcome to the Black Belt Nurse Podcast, where we discuss all things related to violence in healthcare. I'm Bill Schuler, your host, and this is the place where we learn together, mull things over, and generally figure things out. Whether you're a seasoned expert, a student, or just passionate about safety in healthcare, this is the podcast for you. Before we dive in, a quick disclaimer. We do discuss all aspects of violence in healthcare, some of which may be inappropriate for younger listeners and viewers. Please use discretion. The Black Belt Nurse Podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. While we discuss experiences, strategies, and science, this podcast does not provide medical, legal, or professional advice. Always consult your healthcare institution's policies and guidelines or seek professional advice when necessary. And of course, all opinions expressed here are my own and do not represent any employer or organization. Now, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Let's talk about the varying definitions of workplace violence in the healthcare setting. Now, what I'm going to go through is quite a few professional organizations, their definitions, how they compare and contrast. First, let's review the many definitions of workplace violence from varying institutions. Starting off with the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, also known as OSHA. They define workplace violence as any act or threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening, disruptive behavior that occurs at the work site. It ranges from threats and verbal abuse to physical assaults and even homicide. It can affect and involve employees, clients, customers, and visitors. They even say active violence is the third leading cause of fatal occupational injuries in the United States. Next is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, also known as NIOSH. They define workplace violence are violent acts, including physical assaults and threats of assault, directed towards persons at work or on duty. The impact of workplace violence can range from psychological issues to physical injury or even death. The risk for fatal violence is greater for workers in sales, protective services, and transportation. The risk for non-fatal violence resulting in days away from work is greatest for healthcare and social assistance workers. Next is the Joint Commission, which is an accreditation body for hospitals and healthcare in general. They define workplace violence as the act or threat of violence ranging from verbal abuse to physical assaults directed towards persons at work or on duty. They also define it as an act or threat occurring at the workplace that can include any of the following: verbal, nonverbal, written or physical aggression, threatening, intimidating, harassing, or humiliating words or actions, bullying, sabotage, sexual harassment, physical assaults, or other behaviors of concern involving staff, licensed practitioners, patients, or visitors. The International Council of Nurses defines workplace violence as incidents where staff are abused, threatened, assaulted in circumstances related to the work, including commuting to and from work, involving an explicit or implicit challenges to their safety, well-being, or health. The American Nurses Association defines workplace violence as including physical, sexual, verbal, emotional abuse, and harassment directed at individuals while they are at work. Workplace violence is any act or threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening, disruptive behavior from patients, family members, external individuals, and hospital personnel. It includes physical, sexual, and psychological assaults. The Emergency Nurses Association uses the Joint Commission's definition of workplace violence and essentially is any physical assault, threatening behavior, or verbal abuse occurring in the work setting. And lastly, the World Health Organization states that workplace violence includes incidents where staff are abused, threatened, or assaulted in circumstances relating to their work, involving an explicit or implicit challenge to their safety, well-being, or health. They also go on to define it as physical violence, which they define as the use of physical force against another person or group that results in physical, sexual, or psychological harm. It includes, among others, beating, kicking, slapping, stabbing, shooting, pushing, biting, and pinching. And they also further define it as psychological violence, which is the intentional use of power, including threat of physical force against another person or group that can result in harm to physical, mental, spiritual, moral, or social development. It includes verbal abuse, bullying and or mobbing, harassment, and threats. So there you have some varying definitions of what workplace violence is. I think universally they define it as it happens at the workplace. And universally they talk about the threats or the actual physical violence. Now, not all of them include bullying or mobbing, threats or harassment. So this is where you get on bullying at work, worker on worker violence. Now the Joint Commission does consider that as a form of workplace violence. Worker on worker bullying, nurses eating their young, they would consider that as a form of workplace violence. Next are the different types of violence in healthcare. Now, the first one is the most common one that we see in the literature. It's type 1 through 4. And this came out of the University of Iowa Injury Prevention Research Center from 2001. They held a workshop in the year 2000, and they found that most workplace violence incidents fit into these 4 categories. And however, that these categories have different prevention and mitigation strategies. Type 1 is criminal intent. And this is where the perpetrator has no legitimate relationship to the business or any employee. They are coming in to do bad things. And from what they found from their case studies and statistics is that 85% of workplace homicides fit into type 1 or criminal intent. Type 2 is the most common in healthcare. That is a customer client. So this is where the perpetrator is a customer or client of the business. So they could be a patient, they could even be a visitor. The common scenarios in healthcare settings involve patients or their families. Other type 2 violence could include police officers, prison staff, flight attendants, and teachers where they have a customer-client relationship. And when they look at the statistics, 3% of workplace homicides fit into the type 2 category. Type 3 is worker on worker. And it also includes a definition of lateral or horizontal violence. So that's between workers. And the examples are conflict among healthcare staff. And they find 7% of workplace homicides fit into this category. Last is type 4, and this is a personal relationship. This is where the perpetrator has a personal relationship with the intended victim. This could be domestic violence. And they find that 5% of workplace homicides fit into type 4 or the personal relationship type of workplace violence. Now, there has been discussion of a possible 5th type, and that would be ideological violence. And that could be violence that's perpetrated politically or for a religious ideology. And it's not official, but that has been proposed in a couple different areas. There is another typology, and it's referred to as Bowie's typology. Now, Vaughn Bowie is a criminal injuries assessor, and he noted these different types. The first one is intrusive violence, and that includes criminal intent, that includes terrorist acts, as well as protest violence. So if we compared, it would be type 1 and the possible type 5. The next is consumer-related violence, and that is violence between consumers, clients, patients, family members, all against staff. It could also include vicarious trauma to staff, and it could also include staff violence on clients and customers. So it's type 2 in the traditional typology, but it also highlights the violence that staff could commit to clients and consumers. The third is relationship violence, and that can be staff-on-staff violence, which would be type 3. And that could also include bullying as well as domestic violence happening at work, which would be type 4. So that includes type 3 and type 4. And the last one, which is not really much in the traditional typology, and that's organizational violence. It's violence committed by the organization onto staff as well as consumers, clients, and patients. That could include an organization knows that there's workplace violence but does nothing about it or allow the perpetuation of violence against their staff members. It could maybe include if there's a caregiver that is committing crimes against patients or clients and the organization knows about it, doesn't do anything about it, that could be considered organizational violence as well. Now let's get into some of the regulatory and accreditation aspects of violence in healthcare. This is rather broad, but the first one, let's talk about OSHA, or the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They have the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, and that law is designed to ensure safe and healthful working conditions for employees and requiring employers to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards. So that includes workplace violence. Workplace violence is a well-known hazard in the healthcare industry, and OSHA even has specific guidelines on how to assess healthcare agencies for safety, especially regarding to workplace violence. You can pretty much bet if a workplace violence incident makes the news, OSHA as a regulatory body will come and investigate. And then lastly is looking at the accreditation aspect of workplace violence. So accreditation for hospitals is essentially, it's an agency that comes in and makes sure that the hospital or health system is doing what they should. Some of it is tied to federal reimbursement for Medicare and Medicaid. That's where the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services comes in, and they do set some rules for hospitals as a condition of participation. Now, the Joint Commission is one of those accreditation agencies that works on behalf of CMS. The Joint Commission does have rules regarding workplace violence, and I'm going to refer to their sentinel event policy. A sentinel event is a safety event that happens that is not generally related to the patient's diagnosis or the course of their care. Specific to workplace violence, there are 4 sentinel event types in the Joint Commission sentinel event policy. Now, what is a sentinel event? What do you do with that? The Joint Commission requires that a thorough investigation happens, that a root cause analysis is performed, and a development of a corrective action plan is put in place. Now, corrective action is just you're supposed to correct the deficiencies that you found and hopefully prevent a similar event from happening to another patient or another person. The first 2 deal with sexual abuse or assault. So the first one is sexual abuse assault of any patient receiving care, treatment, or services while on site at the organization or while under the care or supervision of the organization. So essentially, if it happens on the property to a patient while they're on site, it's a sentinel event. Now, the second version of that is a sexual abuse or assault of a staff member, visitor, or vendor while on the site, while they're on site at the organization or while providing care or supervision to patients. So essentially how I interpret that is anybody who is on hospital property, if they experience a sexual abuse or assault event, it is a sentinel event. The Joint Commission does further define what they consider to be a sexual assault or abuse event. And in my previous role, I had to reach out to the Joint Commission more than once for even more clarification. But this is what they say sexual abuse or assault is. They say it's non-consensual sexual contact of any type with an individual, and sexual abuse includes but is not limited to the following: unwanted intimate touching of any kind, especially of the breast, buttocks, or perineal area. So it's any unwanted intimate touching of any kind, including the more severe types of sexual abuse assault. They talk about when it could be non-consensual, when a person lacks the cognitive ability or legal ability to consent, or when an individual does not want the contact to occur. Having reached out to the Joint Commission and clarified if unwanted kissing was considered sexual abuse assault, and they answered yes. Also, I had to clarify forced observation, specifically of masturbation. Guys, if you don't know, there's plenty of masturbation happening in hospitals. So I had to clarify with the Joint Commission what forced observation of masturbation means. Let's say there is a caregiver in the room with the patient and they're doing the deed. If the caregiver can look away or leave the room, they would not consider that forced. Now, if the patient got out of the bed and physically threatened the caregiver with a threat to their safety or livelihood or even their life, that would be forced observation. Now, to clarify as well, and this was more my observation and my interpretation, was somebody performing one-on-one constant observation, or commonly known as a sitter, and their instruction was, no, I don't care what the patient is doing. If you look away or leave, you are at risk for discipline or termination. Now that is coerced, and now you are forcing that caregiver to watch that deed. But to go back to, it's really any unwanted touching of any kind. And if you put that in your definition of workplace violence, you might be surprised how often it is happening. In my previous role, one of the largest increases in sentinel events we had was this type, sexual assault, abuse of a staff member. It happens more than you think, happens way more than you want, and it is probably an unspoken problem in healthcare nowadays. What makes the news is the larger physical assault with injury or death, but the quiet thing that is happening is sexual abuse or assault of our caregivers. So we just talked about the sexual abuse assault definition. The other definition is a physical assault. So physical assault of a patient or a physical assault of a staff member, visitor, or vendor while they're on site. So essentially, if there's a physical assault of anybody while on the property, it could be considered a sentinel event. Now, there are some caveats. There are some guidelines. They say it's a physical assault leading to death, permanent harm, or severe harm. Now, I can further define those for you. Permanent harm would be loss of limb, loss of an organ, loss of an eye. That could be anything that affects the daily function of a person. Severe harm, they would typically define as the harm is severe enough that perhaps a person needed a surgery, or they needed to go to the ICU for a period of time, where they needed some sort of care. That's what they would consider severe harm, or even severe temporary harm. Thank you for watching this episode where we defined the different types of workplace violence. I will put some resources in the video description. Please remember to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. That's a wrap for this episode of the Black Belt Nurse Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Drop a comment below and let me know your biggest takeaway. I would love to hear from you. You can find me on LinkedIn and Facebook, as well as blackbeltnurse.com. For now, be safe, and I'll see you in the next episode.